My name is Valerie Powell, and this is my story. At 28 years old, my life looked like anybody else. I was married. I'd been married for 2.5 years. I was successful in starting my career, and everything seemed to have been going well. I'd had glanda in my neck for around 7 years. I'd had several scans just periodically on my neck just to make sure everything was still stable, whatever it was that was there. My mom had just finished going through breast cancer about 2 years before that, but things were settling down in our family, and I just started working at UAB in the research department of radiation oncology, and thought it was probably a good time to, just schedule a CT. Let's just go kind of check on things. It just seemed like the right time to do that. They called me after that CT scan and told me that it was just a little extra piece of my parotid gland, which I took anatomy in high school, but I didn't remember extra pieces of glands and body parts being a thing. So I didn't really know what that meant. They didn't seem concerned about it, so I just went with it. But there was still something in me that just didn't feel right. Like, it didn't feel like all the rest of the times. I guess there was some fear inside of me from what Mom had gone through, because she had had clean mammograms before she was diagnosed with her breast cancer. So there was just something just felt different. I was working as a regulatory officer, so I was reading through protocols, and I remember them setting a binder down on my desk. It was RTOG 1008, which is a salivary gland protocol. So the first study I ended up reading was a salivary gland protocol, and I remember sitting in my desk and my heart fluttering a little bit, like, this is weird. Like, I've never even heard of this, but I mean, it's obviously a type of cancer. So it just startled me a little bit, and then knowing what this scan had shown before, that there was something there enough to show up as an extra piece of my parotid gland, whatever that meant. Something led me out in the hall to go find one of our doctors that I had built, in just a couple months, a trusting relationship with, and ask him to look at my scans.
I remember you had a mass on your CT scan, and it needed evaluation by an ENT surgeon that specialized in cancer. You're a younger person, and there's a lot of emotions about being sure you get what you need and everything. So I certainly wanted to be sure you got the best treatment possible and got you to the right people.
So he did everything but grab me by the hand and take me around the corner to our scheduling department and said, "Hey, can you please get her set up with Dr. Carroll?" The next week, after I'd already had my appointment scheduled with Dr. Carroll, I went to tumor board that Wednesday morning, and there was not one, but 2 salivary gland tumors in that session. And I remember feeling that sinking feeling again, thinking, this is so weird. I've never heard of these things in my life, but I've had this lump in my neck for years. It's kind of around there. Like, the Lord's trying to tell me something. But obviously I didn't want that to be true. The morning that my consult was scheduled with Dr. Carroll, I felt pretty at peace. I had recently had an FNA. I had had another CT. I'd had an MRI, all on my, from just soft tissue, head, neck. And I felt okay about it, despite the couple of run-ins with the salivary gland tumor protocol or case or whatever. I didn't even ask KT to go with me because things just seemed like they'd be okay, just like they'd always had been.
Well, it's not common for young adults to have malignant salivary gland tumors anyway, and the behavior of this had been really fairly benign over 8 years, 9 years. It had been very slowly changing.
I don't remember a ton about the actual consult. I remember Dr. Carroll kind of feeling around my neck, looking in my ears, my mouth, all the things that a regular ENT appointment entails. He had looked at my scans, he had looked at the tissue, and nothing tipped him off as anything to be concerned about. Pretty much the same story that every other doctor, every other person that had looked at it felt was the right answer.
And honestly, the one feature of it that bugged me a little bit was the fact that you were having a little bit of first bite syndrome and you were having a little bit of chronic pain. And those are, we're taught from early on in training that with salivary gland tumors, if they hurt, you got to think about nerves being invaded. You know, the fact that it had been in there as long as it has, the fact that you were already having some symptoms, those things all bugged me a bit.
The one thing I do remember him saying is he kind of leaned over on his knees, put his elbows on his knees, and he said, "Listen, I don't know what that is in your neck, but if you are a part of my family, we're taking it out." And there was no hesitation at all. I said, "Okay, when are we doing it?"
In your case, you know, I'll say something like, you know, if you were my family member, I would say this or that. That's kind of a go-to thing for me, is if somebody's my, you know, what would I do if you were my family member? And I truly am not saying that to patients to twist their arm. I'm really thinking to myself, okay, what would I want, you know, my young niece or something to be going through.
We scheduled surgery about a month out, and July 6th was the date. The morning of, we woke up at 4. I was ready to go. You would have thought we were going on a trip, like getting in a plane and going to Lake Tahoe, which is my favorite place ever. I put on my UAB Radonc t-shirt and some leggings and was acting a complete fool, per usual.
She was just giddy, and she's not a morning person, so, you know, getting up early that day, like you do for surgery, you wouldn't have thought she would have been in the mood that she was in, you know, being excited. So that's how you knew. That's how you knew she was really excited to get it out.
But I do remember driving up I-65 and KT grabbing my hand and saying, "You okay?" And I think at that point there was a moment of like, well, this could go either way. And I remember him praying for us on the way there and saying, you know, whatever outcome this does have, like, I remember him saying, I know surgery's gonna go well, but I'm by your side no matter what. And, you know, recovery is gonna be hard, it's not gonna be fun because you're getting your neck cut open, but like, we got this, we're gonna do this together and it's gonna be great. Those few moments in the car were the only solemn, morose moments that I remember that morning.
So the first half of the operation really was fairly routine. We separated things, found the facial nerve, traced out the upper division branches, began to work on the lower division branches, and we noticed as we did that the tumor was a little sticky in relation to the nerve branches, a little more so than you sometimes see with just a purely benign parotid tumor. It also was going deep to the lower division of the nerve and dunking down into the parapharyngeal space a little more than it often does. That part is just chance of where it's growing, but the stickiness bugged me a little bit.
Dr. Carroll had called KT from the OR and said, things look weird. They're not what I thought it was going to be. And I think this is what we have going on.
And he told me they got it out, that there were no problems or complications with the removal. And I believe that Valerie was being closed at that time. And he just told me that he thought the tumor kind of looked funny, that it wasn't exactly what he expected it to look like for a benign tumor. So he just thought that the pattern and the look that it had made him think it was probably a type of malignant tumor, but that he wouldn't know for sure until it was out and had gone to pathology, but that was his expectation.
We sent the lesion to the lab while you were asleep and asked them to look at it to tell us what they thought it was. And they needed to study it a little more, but they thought from the beginning that there was a chance that it could be an adenoid cystic carcinoma. And so while we were waiting for that frozen section, we took some additional lymph nodes out that were right below where the tumor had been, and we sent those as permanent specimens and that kind of thing, and thankfully those were negative.
Well, after I got off the phone with Dr. Carroll, I went over and talked to Vicki and Paul, Valerie's parents, and gave them the same news. They just kind of looked at me very stoically because they didn't expect that news as well. And I think they were just kind of shocked from it. And they were just trying to process it. We didn't really discuss, the next hours at that time. I just gave them the news, and then I walked around the corner to where my mom was sitting, and I just kind of broke down there because I just knew how excited Valerie was to have it out, and that this was not going to be news that she expected, and that it was going to be heartbreaking news for her. And probably one of the most heartbreaking things and unexpected things to have happened in our marriage to that point. And I knew that I had to go through the next couple of hours anticipating telling her or her hearing it from the doctor, and just knowing what that was going to bring in terms of emotions from her. I heard Valerie before I saw her after surgery, because she was laughing and joking with the nursing staff who had brought her to the room, and that brought me a ton of relief, because Valerie's my partner. She's there with me for everything, and I had to carry that news, not on my own, because I had family there, of course, but there's just something different about having your partner with you for those times. And she wasn't there, for a couple of hours, so it was great relief to hear her voice and to see her, and it was very calming to me, even though I knew what was coming, and to be able to live in this space of we're just all happy and glad that you're out of surgery without surgical complications of any sort, and that you are sitting in the hospital bed fine at this moment, and we just get to sit in that and enjoy it for a few minutes.
At that point, his shadow appeared in the doorway, and my family sort of went quiet. They said, "Hey," of course, but kind of like stood up and huddled around my bed a little bit. And I remember looking around being like, "What are y'all doing? Why y'all so close?" But it was at that moment that Dr. Carroll looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "It really didn't look like we thought it was. There's a cribiform pattern in your tissue." And I'd heard those words before, and I knew it wasn't good. And he said, we have some suspicions of malignancy. Pathology hasn't confirmed it yet. We've sent your tissue down. They're going to look at it, and we should have some answers in the next few days. But from right now, that's what we're going to go with, that we're pretty sure that there's some malignancy in your tumor. Being in rad-onc and working in research for, by that point, it was 4 months in, I knew enough, and of course going to tumor board, I knew enough that I just started firing questions off. I think I remember asking, how big was it? What kind of cancer did you suspect? What are the outcomes for that? What age group is this likely to happen in? Why do you think my biopsy came back negative? I had a million questions, and it was just, I guess, my defense mechanism to get as much quality information as I could at that point with everything I knew and everything I'd heard, so that I didn't lose my mind that night thinking about stuff. I remember it being dead silent when he walked out of the room, and me just kind of looking around at everybody around my bedside and asking if they knew. Because they were all, my mom, my dad, Katie, my brother was there, but at that point, Katie's mom, nobody was crying. Nobody else had any questions but me. They made the ultimate decision not to tell me because they knew I would have questions that they couldn't answer. And they knew how heartbroken I would be. And that I wouldn't be able to listen to Dr. Carroll probably without crying if I'd known prior to him coming in. All I knew at that point was my tumor was about the size of a marble. It was 2.5 centimeters. It was a mixed tumor. And I truly didn't know what the days and weeks ahead looked like. It took several hours for me to kind of believe what he said. It didn't hit me all of a sudden. It wasn't a ton of bricks that just fell on my head. It wasn't a gut punch. It was just kind of okay, this is what we're dealing with.
It's scary. But it was also disheartening in a way, because you were just on the top of the world, happy, and everything was going well, and you'd just going through all the stuff that I had gone through, and it was kind of like we had to switch roles.
As things got quiet that night, KT crawled up in the bed with me, and I think that was the first moment that I cried. I was 28 years old, I was healthy, I was athletic, I had danced my whole life, seemingly done everything right, and this tumor lump that had been in my body for 7 years was now cancer, and I had let it stay there for 7 years. So I was pretty devastated. And the days after that, most of what I remember, I was face down on the couch, just beside myself, thinking I was going to die. How did this happen? Was there anything I could have done differently? God, my poor husband, married 2.5 years, and now his wife has cancer. Right after her mom just went through cancer. We had dreams of having kids and a family and, all kinds of things we had talked about, and all of those dreams seemed shattered in that moment. Mind you, my parents are in the generation where cancer was a death sentence. It was absolutely something that could take your life in an instant, or of course over the course of several months or years. But cancer definitely meant there was a finality to it. So that I just sat in that headspace. It didn't matter who came over or what was going on. All I wanted to do was just stare at the wall. Dr. Carroll ended up calling the day after that appointment where I got my drain out.
Well, your path is back.
Mm-hmm.
It was malignant.
Mm-hmm.
It's an adenoid cystic carcinoma,
Mm-hmm.
and they noticed it in one lymph node that's inside the parotid gland. It just basically directly extended into a lymph node inside the gland.
Okay.
And then the other lymph nodes that we took out from the upper neck area were negative.
I was 28 and I had cancer.
When we found out for sure that's what it was, as much as I hated operating on a 28-year-old lovely young woman who was just married, who works with us, maybe even more so, I hated thinking about putting a lovely 28-year-old through radiation treatment. But it really felt like it would be the right thing, and the tumor board fully agreed with that.
When you're a parent, you just try to be as encouraging as possible.
It was a tough thing to realize that our baby had cancer. And especially in 2 years, my wife and my daughter going through cancer treatments. It was tough to handle.
Simulation was the hardest. I'd seen the mask, I'd been around them, I knew what happened. For head and neck patients, I knew what they were for. I knew it was for safety and, for precision, but there's truly nothing like hot plastic being formed over your face and snapped in, knowing that the reason it's there is because your body created cells that were unhealthy. The only solid information I had was I had cancer and I was about to be under beam for 30 treatments. The first 3 weeks were the absolute hardest 3 weeks of my life. Side effects didn't start showing up until the middle of week 3, but my exhaustion, my energy levels were the first to go. And it really it felt like I was never going to get out of this dark, deep tunnel I was in. Like, it just felt like it was never going to end, but I knew the hammer was going to drop at some point. I knew I was going to feel terrible. I knew I was going to have mouth sores. I knew my face was going to get raw. It was just a matter of when.
Valerie is still at that time getting used to the idea that this is what she's going through and what we're going through. And what does that mean? And what does that mean for how she sees her future? What does that mean for how she sees her own body, both in what she's going through in radiation and in the fact that her body produced cancer? And just what does that mean and what do you take from it? She's dealing with all of those ideas in that moment. And it's a lot. It's a lot to process.
By the end of treatment, I had lost maybe 10 pounds. Like I said, eating was just miserable. The taste in my mouth was so terrible that normal things just tasted awful. Like, I remember one night specifically, I tried to make potatoes, like mashed potatoes. I tried to make pasta. Like, I tried 4 or 5 different things and took one bite and wanted nothing to do with it. But I was so hungry. It used to wake me up in the middle of the night, and I I remember texting with one of my friends, and all I wanted was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which was not going to happen. But I basically survived off of high protein noodles, scrambled eggs, and instant breakfast for 6 weeks. There were things here and there that I could, maybe try. Oh, I ate a ton of tomato soup, which seems completely bizarre, but it was the only thing that tasted like food still. It was the only thing that had its flavor of what I thought it was supposed to taste like. Because it was a mind bender to know what food you're about to eat, put it in your mouth, and it tastes nothing like what you know it to be. Even a sugar-free popsicle was so sweet that I couldn't do it. So that part was hard. But on under treat days, which mine were on Fridays, I always wore my heaviest shoes, which thankfully it was fall, so I could pull out like my boots, like some boots that I had that I knew were pretty heavy, because I was bound and determined to not have to get a feeding tube through this. Like, I'd already been through surgery, but I was not getting a feeding tube. So, and I knew I had to weigh in. So if I wore my heavy shoes, then I had a chance. I never told Dr. Spencer that, don't tell her. But yeah, it was everything I could do to like keep myself half fed and not hangry, on top of being emotionally and mentally just a mess. When the numbers started getting smaller on my wall from my calendar, I started getting a little more peace about it and a little more strength to feel like I could make it through. You don't feel anything when you're under beam. Like, it's literally like I'm sitting here right now. Like, you don't feel anything. But you never forget what you're there for. You never forget what it looks like when you get out of your fraction, look in the mirror, and you have dots all over your face, like Swiss cheese from your mask.
Right after you finished radiation, the photographs that you sent of, your just blistered neck and the puffiness and all of that was, that's hard to see.
Even though you did let people know how painful it was or whatever, that it's a parent's agony, I guess, to see their children suffer. And I couldn't do anything about it but to be there for you.
I'm not an emotional person. I don't cry. I don't typically get upset about things, but I cried enough tears to fill up the Pacific Ocean. It just wasn't the life I saw ahead of myself. And all of that boiled down to my health seemingly failing right in front of me, and trying to grasp and understand that I'm a mortal human.
From my perspective, what else can you do? She's going through the physical symptoms and all the things that come with radiation treatment, and it's easy to kind of tune those sentiments out because of what you're going through, and you're just hearing the same kind of ideas of, yeah, you're going to be fine, but you're physically not fine at that moment. So sometimes felt helpless because I just was trying to reiterate the message, and the message is that you were going to be okay, and just trying to figure out what else I could do.
As with most patients that undergo any kind of cancer treatment, there's residual side effects that kind of just linger on, which is hard to deal with physically, but also it serves as a constant reminder of what I went through and where I was, and just, I couldn't go a single day without thinking about cancer. Like, how would I ever exist in my world that was cancer-free. Even if my body was cancer-free, my mind wasn't. And that tore me up for a really long time. I'm just now within the last probably 6 months to a point where I don't think every ache and pain or everything that happens in my life or memory or whatever, it doesn't remind me of cancer. And that's taken almost 4 years. It was fear of the unknown and fear of what could be going on in my body, because before everything seemed fine and there was cancer growing in my body. So how could I ever know? How could I trust myself, my doctors? How could I trust anything again? Because it literally came out of nowhere and I had no indications other than the lump in my neck. But even then, you know, everyone said it was benign. Things seemingly looked normal by around Christmas time that year. But I think anybody that was close to me at that point knew that I was so far from normal. I was honestly shattered in pieces and had to look for those pieces to even pick them up and think about where they might go to put me back together. But I did what I could to get from surgery to that point and make it through what I needed to fix or to treat the cancer, and just knew I had an uphill battle from there as far as mental and emotional health and potentially physical health. It took some time to understand that I gotta find a way to mentally and emotionally find normalcy. You know, you grow up thinking that you're a child, you're an adult, you have kids, you have a family, and then you get old and you die. But the reality for me was a cancer diagnosis at 28. That meant my life may not look like that. My life may end a lot sooner than that. And I had to mentally process what that meant and what that looked like and what the consequences of that were for my family, for my husband, for friends I had, and really just how I chose to live life every day. I can't live every single day worrying about what's going to get me next, paying so much attention to my body and what it feels like, which as a dancer, that's incredibly hard, because we're taught to hone into little tiny muscles and little parts of things to create the lines and the images as a dancer. So I'm very self-aware in my body as it is, and this just increased that exponentially. It was like I was on a roller coaster, and poor KT didn't know which version of me he was going to get which day, because I could be happy-go-lucky and be myself again, or something could have triggered me and I could be absolutely terrified, or making jokes as defense mechanisms like, oh, well, if I'm still here by then.
But that bothered me a lot, because I, for one, felt like she was going to be fine and that she was going to be around for our whole lives together.
Which I didn't think were harmful at that point, but, come to find out, several months later that was probably hurting his heart too. And that was insensitive of me to say those things. But it was what was in my head at that point, and that was how I was coping. That's the only way I'd figured out at that point to get through each day. Scan days are hard. I don't breathe that day until I hear those words. Everything's stable. It looks fine. And even now, every 6 months, those days are still nervy. I have a little more confidence now because, I just had my 4-year scans, and you know, I can look back and count how many scans I've had and how many times they've said no evidence of disease, conditions are stable, inflammation in the spinal cord is exactly how it's been the whole time. And, you know, that gives me some confidence, but there's also the thoughts in my mind, well, it's been long enough now, you know, maybe it takes this long for something to start growing back. You know, it doesn't, just because I'm out this far doesn't mean those thoughts go away. It's not just, you know, health things that you worry about every day. You worry about your relationships, your friends. You know, does my family, are they still kind of waiting on me to, you know, something else to happen, the other shoe to drop? You know, I don't know how people perceive me at this point. I very much want to be, you know, I think everybody does. You want to be liked, you want to be appreciated, you want to be, you know, cared for, and having cancer as a label on you just makes that so much harder.
She is first and foremost a caring person. She would probably tell you that sometimes she cares too much. She is a very loyal friend and wife, but she is there for anyone that needs her as often as she can be. And that's who she is. It's nothing to do with her cancer diagnosis from 4 years ago. It's just because that's who she is. I tell the story about the first thing I thought of when I saw or heard her after surgery was relief, and it's because she's just that person that I need through anything, and she brings me peace by just being around me.
I was really mad for a long time. Katie and I are both, you know, very grounded in our faith, and we've always trusted the Lord to protect us, to care for us, to provide for us. And, you know, there was a stint about a year or so long, you know, in the last 4 years where I was just mad. I was really angry that I felt like the Lord didn't protect me in those moments, that He still let me get cancer. And, you know, my mom had just gone through it, and, you know, what else was going to happen? Like, it just felt like we were standing naked out in the middle of a field with, I mean, armies surrounding us.
Trust is a big part of our faith life, and so how do you make sense of what's happened? And sometimes you can't, because there's a greater purpose that we don't see in the here and now, that you may see as you look back on the years, and you may not see it. And that's not an easy thing to deal with at that age particularly, but at all.
At some point it clicked for me that, you know, there were so many things the Lord protected me from. I had absolute angels surrounding me as my therapist, as my coworkers, as, you know, I mean, my husband, just everything about him, he could not have been more supportive, more caring, more in my corner and anything I needed. He's never made me feel broken or deformed or, you know, any of those thoughts that I had about myself. He's spoken the opposite to me. Every year on July 6th, my surgery anniversary, Katie and I kind of, you know, sit down. I make him tell me the story of what happened while I was in surgery. And this year, the 4th anniversary of my surgery, was the first time that I looked at him and I said, this was so hard. Like, I know I pushed through it, and I know that I looked strong at points and courageous and brave, but everything I went through was really, really hard. And not like physically, yes, but the mental and the emotional journey that this has been is so much harder than I would have ever imagined. that's the part that stays with you. And I know for some patients it is the physical part that stays with you. You know, you have recurrence, you have progression, but for me, thankfully I didn't have the physical ailments and all of that, but I can imagine someone going through the mental and emotional part along with physical. I'm so proud that I've gotten as far as I have. When I look back at myself, sometimes I don't know how I made it through. I mean, at this point, I find joy in being able to tell somebody how it was, because I wish there had been somebody for me to say, hey, here's what you're looking at, and here's what it might feel like. Here's kind of an analogy to what you might be seeing or feeling or thinking, and just here's a heads up. You know, as doctors, you have to be so gentle with the things you say, and you know, some of it is so not scripted, but it's thought through, and you know what your boundaries are and your limits. But sometimes I think a patient just needs to sit down with someone and, you know, get down to the nitty gritty, the raw, this is gonna suck for a minute. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. No matter how long your tunnel is, no matter how dark it is, in some way there is light if you look for it. I guess that's what I feel like my job is as an advocate, is to share the gory details of what I went through, share the mess that mortality made of my mind. And, you know, looking back at my tunnel and how incredibly dark and daunting and just exhausting it felt so many times, I look at myself now and, you know, I'll realize it's been 3 or 4 days since I've thought about cancer. And that is truly a place I never thought I would get to in my life. And, you know, that's not a pat on my back or anything. That's really just, you know, people speaking into my life, praying constantly, trying to get myself together, working through my thoughts and my emotions, and being just open and honest with my family, my husband, the people that have cared, and just, you know, just trying to be me and just be exactly that through everything. It's taken a long time for me to kind of understand that this happened so that I could tell you my story. This happened so I could give you this perspective, and you could potentially bring it into your clinical practice, knowing what the mind of a patient potentially looks like outside of the 20 minutes you see of them in follow-up. Compassion and time are so incredibly important when you see your patients. Just asking truly how they're doing, looking in their eyes and asking how they're really doing. That could make the difference of how they feel about their diagnosis and about their just where they are in life, no matter what their news is on scan day.
One of my favorite things about Valerie is how she thinks she's funny. Sometimes that's with jokes, but most often that's with pranks. She really likes to jump out from behind corners and scare people. No matter how that's going to affect them, it's going to make her laugh. So it's funny to her.